Hello, hello, hello. This is the Subversive Podcast. I am Alex Kashuta, and today joining me is Mary Harrington, a writer and columnist for Unheard, and probably one of the best voices that I know of in terms of commenting on the endless gender wars, on feminism, and on what's going on today with whatever's going on between women and men. Welcome,
Hi.
Mary.
Hi, Alex.
The first question that I have is one that has been plaguing me for a while. What is reactionary feminism? Is it mostly reactionary, or is it feminism, or why?
Well, it kind of started as a running joke with a friend who's been trying to convince me that post-liberals are just reactionaries who refuse to inhale. Um,
Maybe.
which is it's not a it's a possibility I have not yet discounted, although I have some questions about that as well. So reactionary feminism, but I thought about it and I thought, well, I've always thought of myself as a feminist, but as time has gone on and I've got further into my life and further into motherhood and further into marriage and just into thinking about the relations between men and women and the political dimension of that at the larger scale, I've come to the conclusion that the progressive view has some shortcomings. And more broadly, I came to the conclusion that really I just don't believe in progress. And that makes it, there are, I sort of bounced that off an argument which recurs within feminism more generally. For example, in Jessica Valenti's recent article, where she states that it's not possible to be conservative and a feminist. And I thought about that and I thought, well, she's kind of right in the sense that conservatism is really just about doing progress a bit more slowly. These are people standing athwart history yelling stop. They essentially want the same kind of liberal things as the progressives do. They just like it to happen a bit more slowly and a bit more respectfully to tradition. But what happens then if you want to advocate for women's interests and you just don't believe in progress, full stop? You can't
Yes.
really describe yourself as a conservative because that's not what you're doing. You're trying to look at what constitutes women's interests outside the rubric of progress altogether. And I thought, well, given once you're into that territory, you're going to get called a reactionary whether you like it or not. So I think I figured I might as well just own it. So it's kind of a joke. It's kind of internet irony, but it also has a serious dimension to it as well.
Yes.
And I think you.
I can definitely relate to that. And I mean, in any sense of the word, if this is what we're calling it, that's probably what I would identify with. I'm not a conservative in any modern sense. I'm a return traditionalist, if in any way that is possible, with the V, of course. So
Welcome to reactionary feminism.
exactly. I mean, if this is the movement, yeah, count me in. um, I've seen some comments of yours on the nature of childhood and kind of how childhood's been reinterpreted through the modern lens of it being something that has to be completely constrained by the adult world, with play dates, with extreme over socialization, helicopter parenting, and this kind of medicalization of how we raise children, this expert led push to raise them in a very regimented way. And I know you're a mother and you know how to do this. What is wrong with this approach? Is it kind of an exaggerated form of safetyism?
Well, I think the first thing I should say about this is that actually in practice, as a parent, as a mother, it's very, very difficult to avoid this. I mean, some of what we think of as helicopter parenting and sort of over socialization, safetyism, and so on is more an effect of what the modern world looks like. Is as much an effect of the modern world. I mean, it's very difficult to let your 4-year-old go out and play in the street if there are no other mums around with 4-year-olds at home. So there's no one for her to play with. And also the street is full of cars, some of whom come down at 30, 40 miles an hour. So it's easy to frame that as safetyism, but actually to a significant extent what's going on is more structural and is part of a much bigger sociocultural and economic picture. And I should also say that it's very difficult to, or nigh on impossible, short of radically homeschooling, taking a sort of parenting Benedict option, kind of an approach, which is not where I am. You cannot raise your child out with prevailing social norms. So, you know, a great deal of what I might critique as overparenting, if you like, is also very difficult to avoid in practice. And, you know, I'm to a significant extent complicit in that, because I can't not be, short of going and living off grid in the hills, which creates its own problems. But I think, you know, zooming out to the sort of cultural level, I think part of what's going on is a fundamental crisis in our understanding of authority and what constitutes legitimate political authority. You might say that that's a big sledgehammer to crack the walnut of, you know, parenting, but to my eye, you know, the debate, one of my sort of fundamental theses is that all the major political debates can be found in parenting debates. The stuff that mums argue about on parenting message boards is the same stuff that's being played out at the macro scale in politics. Mm. So the argument about baby-led weaning, you know, whether or not you should spoon feed your baby or give them a range of easily chewable foods that they can mash and throw around, you know, that question is mirrored, for example, in the question of whether or not riots should be constrained or responded to. Mm. I mean, I'm sure you can see the analogy.
Certain, you know, riots,
should we?
Yeah. Not all riots.
So, right, exactly. And that question again is political. You know, why some riots and not others? Why some misbehavior in your child and not others? All of these questions are political, but in essence, it's the same question at the big and the small scale. You know, to what extent do we follow the emergent desires of a baby or of a crowd? Which emergent desires are or aren't acceptable? Which should be which face the ban hammer? Which ones don't? You know, that's the terrain of politics. But underpinning all of that, there's a deep anxiety about whether it's ever acceptable to impose top-down authority, and in whose name, on the basis of which moral norms. Exactly. Because, you know, we have a kind of dramatic convention which says that there are no legitimate moral norms.
Yes,
and yet
extreme form of Rousseau that's been infiltrating every aspect of our lives.
Exactly, yeah. And you know, I mean, the liberals grasp the parallel between politics and parenting. I mean, you know, both John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote extensively about how to raise children. In fact, they were the ones who pioneered the modern parenting manuals. So in a sense, the foundations of modern post-Enlightenment liberalism are inseparable from the foundations of expert-led parenting, as opposed to parents being left to follow their own judgment or the advice of their grandparents.
Exactly. And there's this kind of this sacralization of the natural, this romanticism about human nature that seems to me to be at the core of all of this. The idea that, you know, if civilization is what corrupts, but in the absence of civilization, people would just be nice to each other. And I think anyone who's lived outside of the safetyism knows that is not true. And I feel like someone coming from Eastern Europe, and you know, I've kind of seen the dark face of man in many interactions while I was growing up, and it was clear that the dividing line was between the people who had been civilized and the people who just didn't get the chance to go through the process to be de-Rousseau'd, and it's quite shocking to see that people just don't. Maybe they just haven't had, you know, the hands-on experience to see that, you know, the default setting of people is quite barbaric, and the default setting of children by default is a little bit barbaric as well.
Yeah, I mean, to my eye, anybody who has eyes, a functioning brain, and small children gets that you can't just leave them to resolve all conflicts by themselves.
Yeah, but fewer and fewer people are having small children. I think that's also, and they're having them later and later. So, you know, they just miss out on this foundational experience of being alive, and they can, you know, nurse these fantasies for longer. And I think that's probably feeding this political radicalism as well.
Absolutely, I think you're spot on about that. You know, it's much easier to maintain the delusion about the fundamental innocence of childhood, and about the fundamental niceness of people. If you only have, say, one or two children, and you only introduce them, you see them in contact with other children in carefully stage managed play dates of, say, 90 minutes at a time. And especially if you haven't really even really got to that point until your political ideology is well solidified in your mid-30s, and 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 you're just not you're not in a position to watch your children just kind of figuring things out for themselves. And you can probably argue, I mean, my position is also very much that the first generation of the children who've been raised like this, you know, in these carefully stage managed play dates and, you know, with carefully managed interpersonal conflicts all the way through their childhood, are also now coming to young adulthood. And I think that it's not a coincidence that we're also seeing a falling away of faith in and ability to survive the conflict which is intrinsic to democratic debate. As in, people are forever tearing their hair saying, oh, you know, why are the young so authoritarian? You're like, why are you even surprised, considering you've been stage managing their interpersonal conflicts for the first 21 years of their lives? Then you send them off to college and demand that their colleges must stage manage their interpersonal conflicts all the way through college, and then they pop out into adult life and you're surprised that they're a bit authoritarian. What were you expecting?
Yeah, and it's the authoritarianism of their childhood is not the strong hand of the patriarch. It's this weird therapy type of authoritarianism that's quite even chaotic in a way. You don't really know what to expect. It's kind of the devouring mother stage managing you, rather than, there are 10 rules, respect these 10 rules or else, it's all quite ambiguous. And I feel like maybe even just the absence of that maybe creates a bit of a void that children want to play act when they get to college and say, no, we need something a little bit more stronger. This magic is too weak. So maybe they're kind of filling in the authoritarian void there.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think one of the things that I realized sort of when my child was not even very old, but as soon as she was old enough to have some kind of will and agency of her own, which is to say, I don't know, less than a year old, but certainly by the time she got to toddlerhood, is that gentleness and persuasion is not always enough, and actually it's irresponsible to try and parent and to try and mother purely based on gentleness and persuasion. Because there are times when, especially if you're looking at an extremely distressed young child, in fact, they're not able to contain and regulate their emotions on their own because they just don't have the cognitive maturity. And if, when you're confronted with that situation, your response is to say, well, what do you want? You're only going to make it worse.
Yeah, because they don't know.
They don't know. They don't know. And not only that, but they're so beside themselves at that point that they wouldn't be able to articulate it even if they did know. And in fact, the most responsible, the kindest thing you can do at that point is to say, okay, here's what's going to happen now. And then you make it happen. Mm-hmm. And that is the swiftest and most compassionate way to contain what's actually an incredibly frightening and distressing situation for a very, very young child. And I think there are I mean, I've practiced as a psychotherapist as well. And there are parallels in that situation too, where I've experienced a client coming to me who's extremely uncontained, who's very distressed, who's perhaps sort of spinning out in a kind of traumatic fugue state, and in those situations, asking them to explore their feelings is not appropriate. What you need to do is to set gently but firmly a set of boundaries that they can push against. And again, one of the phenomena that's really characterized this. A lot of these uprisings over the last year, to me, has a lot of the character of a hysterical child acting out desperately, asking for somebody to push back and to provide some containment and some boundaries. I think these disturbances are multifactorial. There are legitimate grievances in there. There are economic insecurities. It's a very complex situation. But I think certainly as far as the middle class children who are acting out in the middle of it all, sort of LARPing, if you like, this kind of revolutionary fervor, I think a great deal of it comes down to desperately seeking some sort of boundary, some sort of containment, which is less along in the sort of devouring mother.
Yes, and you can
quality
see
and more.
Yeah, you can see how disrespectful these children essentially get when they don't get pushback. it's, I think it was videos from Evergreen, and there are a few instances in colleges where this was filmed, where they were berating the administrators, and the administrators didn't know where to put their hands, or they were, controlling their body language, and it was just very, I don't know, it reminded me of, the Cultural Revolution, and just the humiliation that they had to inflict upon these people just because there was no pushback. They weren't even trying.
What's really difficult is that, this sort of this screaming for boundaries is occurring at the heart of a culture where it's people routinely say, oh, it's not I don't have the right to tell anybody else what to do. What right do we have to tell anybody else what to do? And when you apply that to children, what you end up with is child-led parenting, which is to say, what right do I as a parent have to tell my child what to do? My child as an individual knows what's best for them. And it's my job to facilitate that. I respectfully disagree. There are times when my child does not know what's best for her because she's 4. It's my duty to tell her what's best for her because I'm her mother. There was a funny situation like that not long ago, where my daughter, who's now 4, and she's grubby, as you'd expect with a 4-year-old. The bath is run, she's all ready to get in it, and she suddenly announces, I don't want to have a bath. And I say, well, you're having a bath. And she says, well, you can't make me. And I said, well, actually, yes, I can. And I picked her up and I put her in the bath.
Well, that's I think that's gentle authority, because the consequences of her not taking a bath for too long are
right, exactly. I think, but where the broader point to be made from this, I mean, aside from it just being a funny story, the broader point to be made from this is that, in my view, asserting authority is inseparable from being comfortable with the idea of making positive statements about moral norms. If you don't have any confidence in your ability to make positive statement about norms, you cannot legitimately occupy an authoritative position. Yes. So I have no qualms whatsoever about making authoritative statements in favor of personal hygiene. That's not a difficult one, but there are much more ambiguous areas where you'll be called as a parent to make those sorts of authoritative statements about moral norms. And if you abdicate that in favor of letting the child lead, in my view, you're not doing the child any favors. I mean, there is always a delicate dance to be done between allowing a child to explore for themselves and making those kinds of pronouncements. But it's certainly my view that actually they're asking for those pronouncements. Yes. And it's also true that you cannot avoid making them. Even if you think you're not making them, you're making them. Yes. Whether you like it or not, you'll be installing a moral operating system in your child, because they come in need. They come with whatever they come with, but they expect from their parents a set of general statements about the moral norms. So you're in a position where that is unavoidable, and you might as well make a thoughtful decision about which of those operating systems you're planning to install.
Exactly. And is it possible to install this operating system if every other institution in your culture is pulling into the other direction? And I guess, after a certain point, your child will have to integrate with peers rather than be part of the family structure. That's going to be their tendency. That's all children, want to separate from the nest at one point. Will the original system be enough to hold back the ravages?
I don't think anybody really knows that. And it's certainly true that once your kid is over, I don't know, probably 2 or 3 at the absolute most, there's a very limited extent to which you have control over what it is that they absorb. I mean, just taking consumption of media, for example. I know there are parents who radically constrain their kids' consumption, for example, of Hollywood movies, and there's a strong case to be made for that. I'm not quite as extreme about that, but I do sometimes wince at the sort of high-level messages that I see being internalized from, for example, the Disney corpus, which to my mind certainly invites some questions. You can be anything you want to be. I don't think that's true, but that's the central message of much of the Disney corpus. But against that, I don't really think there's anything much that you can do apart from to lead by example and to make some thoughtful decisions about what stories you intentionally offer your child. I mean, I'm unabashed about teaching the Bible stories to my daughter, because I think it's wildly irresponsible for a child growing up for a parent of a child growing up in the West to have her illiterate about that. You know, scriptural literacy is a fundamental building block of cultural literacy in the entire Western canon. And, you know, as somebody who's with a deep love of canonical Western literature myself, I read English and I read widely. I think it's incredibly irresponsible. I grew up without scriptural literacy and had to teach it to myself as an adult. That's a pain in the ass. If you have it baked in from the word go, then your streets ahead. You know, further down the line, you know, she'll get the Greek, the ancient Greek, she'll get the classical mythology, and a whole bunch of other stuff, which is just fundamental building blocks. And to an extent, that's all you really can do. Is that teach the basics, teach good manners, model that stuff at home. And the interaction of that with the wider culture is inevitably going to be unpredictable. And short of going full sort of parenting Benedict option, and that's really all you can do. You know, these are, you know, hyperliberalism is the water that we all swim in. And I think we kind of just have to roll with that.
Exactly. And by giving your child the building blocks, you're putting them, you know, leagues ahead of everyone else. And I feel like maybe what's going on in colleges right now is also the result of people not giving a few generations their building blocks, because it's almost impossible to teach the Western canon without having the basics, without, you know, understanding the Bible, understanding, you know, Greek mythology. And if someone were to read even, you know, Shakespeare at the moment, your average or even your more educated high school senior will not understand it, because just the allusions, the metaphors, everything baked into the cake is absolutely foreign. And maybe that's why, you know, partly radicalism has taken over the institutions, because there's nothing else to teach except critique, and there's no other lens to internalize than the one that Disney has offered about empowerment.
Yeah, I think there's a great deal of truth in that. I mean, one of the things, I graduated from university some time ago. I'm 41 now, so I graduated in 2002, which is just when, you know, the current iteration of madness was arguably all just kicking off with the, you know, the Twin Towers and the Iraq War, and that was when reality really started to go strange, I think. Mm-hmm. But, you know, something which has happened since, I remember encountering critical theory at university alongside being frog marched fairly straightforwardly through the entire English literary canon from Beowulf onwards, you know, at a fair pace and with some gaps, but I got a decent sense of the outlines of it. And I'll never regret having taken the time to do that. But one of the things that really struck me about critical theory as it was then taught was that it was not yet separable from canonical literacy itself, as in, you know, you're expected to be able to deconstruct, but you're also expected to have read the texts, you know, whereas what's happened since, which is so very strange, is that it's come on board even from any kind of meaningful literacy in the canon, which it emerged out of, and it's sort of spiraled free into a kind of, you know, ungrounded, unrooted sort of criticism of everything, such that, you know, it's a sort of free floating kind of deconstructive impulse, which says, no, actually, everything, all forms of meaning, whether they're social or cultural or whatever, are fair game for being dismantled, and there's no corresponding effort or desire or attempt to build anything up to replace it. And I feel like that's the moment we're in, and we're at the point where pretty much any social meaning you care to name has been radically liquefied by this impulse, and it's not yet clear at all what's going to be rebuilt out of the remainder, because but it's also clear to me that we can't not rebuild something.
Yes, absolutely, and I think it's a primarily Western affectation. I mean, it's seeping into Eastern Europe as well as we speak, because we're kind of a wannabe West and still very aspirational to get in line. But I think in countries like China, this type of moral relativism is less prevalent. It's not dominant. It might be kind of an intellectual affectation, but because they don't really care about intellectuals as much as we do, they don't really implement it as strongly. I'm curious to see if the pressure surrounding the West will kind of make people toughen up a little bit, and kind of regain confidence. I mean, there's obviously, I know a lot of sections of the internet and sections of the world where this is happening, and people are fighting for Western civilization and trying to be confident about it. But in general, it's not a mainstream phenomenon, and I'm curious to see if it ever will be. What's your feeling on this?
Well, it's probably too early to tell, but one possibility which I was discussing recently for 2021, especially in the light of the just very recent QAnon invasion of Washington, is that a culture which up until now has seen mass movements as axiomatically good may start to reconsider that position in favor of, sometimes top-down authority being possibly not quite as axiomatically bad as we thought. It's been palpable how differently this recent mass uprising was received to all of the disturbances over last summer. It's not original to point that out. But I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about, the kinds of people who are applying that double standard, and thinking, well, from the point of view of your average sort of normie mainstream liberal, you've been raised on a diet of movies and media content and stories and a cultural output which sees mass cultural uprisings as liberatory and good. And then suddenly one comes along which actually contradicts that view for you. The Black Lives Matter uprisings last summer, they look liberatory, they look like the good guys, especially as long as you look past all of those Somali heritage shop fronts burning in Minneapolis. That was all good stuff. That was liberation, right? And then all of a sudden a bunch of guys come along that you're used to thinking of as the bad guys, and they're also doing a mass uprising, and you're like, hang on a minute, maybe this whole mass uprising thing doesn't actually come with baked in moral content. And at that point, it's just possible, I don't know yet, but it's just possible that we might see even people who have hitherto been unquestioningly liberal starting to tilt back and ask whether or not it's a possibility that authority, there might actually be a role sometimes for authority within a functioning society. And what will come of that, again, is too early to say.
This year has been full of black pills for everyone.
It has, but because there's also loops back to the question of, what does authority look like in the absence of being willing to make positive statements about moral norms? And the answer is not very nice.
Exactly.
So if you have a bunch of liberals who are tilting back in favor of authority, but they're also still reluctant to make any statements about moral norms, what you have then is an authoritarianism which is based on pure power. And that's not a world I want to live in, but it may be the world that we end up living in 2021.
Exactly.
Again, it's too early to tell.
Yeah, I think one thing that 2020 has taught me is that we're led by a bit of a mysterious cabal of unaccountable managers in a stratification that's like 15 layers deep, and no one really knows what's going on. There's no, even when you need top-down control, it can't be exercised, but it is concentrated. So it's quite a shocking turn. And in the area of having direct moral and clear moral norms, I know you've commented on the porn censorship scandals that have been surrounding, especially Pornhub, after the famous New York Times article about abuses on the website. And you're not a sex positive feminist.
I'm not.
Good. And you're also pro.
Well, let me rephrase that. I'm not a pro prostitution feminist. I mean, sex is great. Sex is really nice.
Yeah.
Sex for money, I think is bad.
Yes, exactly. I mean, yeah, I can only echo that. But porn censorship. Porn is also a bit of a gray area because people say, "Oh, it's not really prostitution." I mean, only in the strictest sense is it not. And there's also the kind of the complicating factor of OnlyFans, which is kind of just this kind of one unilateral type interaction where it's very low touch. It's a bit bourgeois compared to your average streetwalker. So there's all sorts of things in the panoply of whatever is pornography nowadays. I personally, I've made several arguments about why I don't think the normalization of this is useful. Why do you think that porn censorship is warranted?
Well, there are several points where you could start with that question. Um, the first one, I suppose, would be because living people are involved in producing it. There, I suppose, you'd have to distinguish between written erotica or drawn erotica, and erotica and porn, which is produced, photographs or videos taken of actual human beings. And if, in my view, if you're going to have pornography at all, it should not, live individuals should not be used in creating it. So I mean, if I were to make any kind of a compromise at all, I would say it's a little bit like cruelty-free cosmetics. You should. It's. I think it's fundamentally morally grotesque to ask actual living individual humans to play act the sex act for the titillation of others who they've never even come across.
But Mary, it's free will. These are consenting adults.
Consent is a very grey area, I think. There are other more sophisticated intelligences than mine have done a pretty good job of a fairly thorough job of dismantling this idea of the wholly autonomous, the wholly independent individual subject, and the idea that consent is morally adequate as a benchmark for whether or not somebody should be participating in something like that. I mean, I watched with great interest the interview Unheard Freddie Sayers did on Unheard with Ayala, the OnlyFans superstar, where she said, it's possible to do this for a living and not be dying inside. And I'm perfectly happy to take her at her word that she's not dying inside. Although saying that, she did also post some stats from her personal health tracker not long afterwards, where she listed the amount of time she spends on benzodiazepines, which raised for me some questions about, what dying inside actually would look like for her. But leaving that aside, I think it's all very well saying it's possible to do this without dying inside. But it's also wildly irresponsible, if you are one of the outlier personalities who's able to do that without dying inside, to normalize that situation for a bunch of people who may find themselves economically with very few other potential career choices and without that personality. So, just because it's all right for you, to put it another way, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be all right for other people. And I think Ayala to me looks like one of the winners of social liberalism, a little bit like the hedge fund managers are the winners of economic liberalism. And in essence, they just don't give a shit about the trail of destruction they leave behind them, in hollowed out industrial communities and small businesses going bankrupt while the profits are funneled upwards into BlackRock or whoever. And to me, I see people like Ayala, the winners of social liberalism, as something analogous.
Exactly.
They're just not looking at what it's like for the little guy who may not possess their psychological advantages, and they just prefer not to look.
Yeah, and they close themselves in the essentially the excuse of consent. This this big this only moral trigger that we have left in how we deal with people and how we kind of essentially administer morality in society. Was it consensual? Good, perfect. Yeah. Move
and
on.
I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical about the idea that the end of the human subject is quite as sort of autonomous as all of that. Anyway, I mean, this is something which post-structuralism does a particularly good job of dismantling, and as such, I find it strange that most of the sort of postmodernism 2.0 has come round fully to embracing this idea of radical individualism and consent being an adequate rubric for absolutely everything. in a context where, you know, the postmodernism 1.0 was all about deconstructing the subject as a plausible, as a convenient fiction.
Yeah.
So, you know, if we're deconstructing the subject as a convenient fiction, you know, shouldn't we problematize? Shouldn't we be problematizing the idea of consent, not reifying it as the ground zero for absolutely everything? I mean, this is probably a bit of a digression from pornography, but I mean, it supports one of my other theses, which is that postmodernism 2.0, which has been sort of popularized as wokeism, is not in fact postmodern at all. You know, James Lindsay and the rest of them are mistaken about that. It's not postmodernism. It's the last stand of high modernism.
Exactly. Yeah, that's, you know, and also I think postmodernism has kind of gotten this vibe. I mean, I love Jordan Peterson, but he has been the primary kind of the first mover on you know, on taking postmodernism to be this singularity that, you know, something happened in the 60s, and it was from then on the course of liberalism, which is pure and you know, and holy,
Yes,
has changed, and you know, this mind virus has infected the academia. Well, maybe if you trace it back to the Reformation, but not to the 60s. So it's quite a meme, but I agree it's definitely not the first thing.
yeah. But one of the most acute analysts of this, to my eye, is Jeff Schellenberger, who writes as Outsider Theory, who's just one of the fantastic, rare writers who's both incredibly well informed on theory and also able to write it and do theory without disappearing up his own button in terms of prose style.
He's been on this podcast. It's not released yet.
He has.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. I'm very pleased to hear it. His writing is, I'm a massive fan, and his read of Pluckrose and Lindsay's book Cynical Theories I found very illuminating, in that he points out that an actually materialist analysis of the emergence of theory suggests that it's not just something which sort of popped into existence mysteriously in the 1960s, but in fact develops out of social and cultural conditions which have, you know, including the development of science, all of which have worked to undermine, you know, our faith in grand meta-narratives, to the point where, you know, just complaining about the undermining of faith in grand meta-narratives is not going to do anything to change the fact that nobody really believes in them anymore.
Exactly. And that the fact that, you know, Lyotard and most of postmodernists were descriptive rather than prescriptive. They were chroniclers of phenomena that were happening already, rather than being the people saying, wouldn't it be nice if we thought about things this way? Well, people were already thinking about them that way.
Yeah,
exactly. The only other thing that I wanted to discuss with you was the LARPing, essentially.
Well, I mean, the loss of faith in grand meta-narratives kind of brings us nicely to that point, doesn't it?
Exactly.
You know, the world according to LARP. This is something which I found really interesting. The escape of the word LARP from being something which geeks do at the weekend to being a this kind of probably, I think, the defining political metaphor of 2020, and it's showing great promise so far for 2021 as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I think,
you know,
nobody's ever expressed a political opinion on the internet recently without being accused of LARPing in some way.
Yes. Well, and I mean, it's, you know, these guys who just broke into the Capitol in Washington. You know, they got into Nancy Pelosi's office and they couldn't think of anything else to do apart from sit in her chair and pretend to make phone calls. And I think that speaks volumes about well, different kinds of political power, among other things. You know, because sure, you know, it speaks of a certain kind of political power to be able to break into the Capitol full stop, you know, as part of a mob. But it's another kind of political power altogether, you know, once you're in Nancy Pelosi's office, to pick up the phone and know who to call, and to have that person take your call. That's a very different kind of political power. And, you know, there's this slippage between a sort of mediated appearance of doing something, or even a mediated appearance of power, and, you know, the nature of the, you know, and what's real, or indeed, you know, what constitutes actual power, I think is the terrain of politics now. And perhaps this comes back to the question which I was wrestling with before about, how and on what basis we feel comfortable making definitive moral pronouncements. Is it just about pure power, or is there anything actually substantive underneath the interactions and the operations and the contests for who has power, that can ground whatever pronouncements and whatever we make or whatever conclusions we come to. Is there anything real out there? I think that's really the question which absolutely everybody is wrestling with. And in as much as, but we're doing this against a background of, more and more of us, especially under lockdown, being confined to our rooms and experiencing the world through little screens and, the back and forth of argument on Twitter or wherever.
Yeah.
So, even as we get more and more desperate to get a sense of, what is actually real underneath all of that. And for people who've died of coronavirus or just lost their jobs and are facing being evicted from their apartments, the idea that there's nothing real out there is obviously bollocks.
Yeah, yes. There's definitely a big fracturing of reality for the people who can afford to have reality fractured and don't have to live in base reality, who are not the couriers and the people, on the ground moving things in physical meat space.
Yes.
And I think,
absolutely,
yeah, they're probably the only people not LARPing because they're not living in hyper reality. They're, if I'm an Uber driver, I'm an Uber driver. There's not really much LARPing involved. But if your main world is hyper reality, the hyper reality of working from home, of having everything delivered, then yeah, you're probably LARPing because it's you're already living in a simulation of your own choosing.
Right, but it's equally true that within the LARP there are other kinds of real emerging, but because it's not as if the cultural domain has zero impact on what's actually real. I mean, it's you only have to look at the way the domain of LARP. We can call it LARP world as opposed to courier world for the sake of argument. You only have to look at the way LARP world managed to force a sort of moral panic, which drove the first, then the second, then the third lockdown in the United Kingdom, to see that actually, LARP world has very direct effects on courier world. So it's not as though the hyperreal has. It's not as though it's wholly unmoored from having real world impacts, if you like. I mean, I suppose you could take political propaganda as another example of where these kinds of reality intersect. I mean, I follow a number of Chinese state Twitter accounts with some interest, because it's the intensifying competition between the American LARP and the Chinese LARP is one which interests me. And perhaps the most fundamental question which has preoccupied me for most of my adult life is, at what point does a LARP stop being a LARP and just become what it is?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I mean, it's been a sort of central contention of the American dream for a very long time. Long before anybody invented the internet. That if you believe in your dreams hard enough and you work at it hard enough, eventually those dreams will come true. I mean, again, that's the entire Disney corpus. If you LARP hard enough, it will stop being a LARP and it will just become what it is. And there's a degree of truth to that.
Yeah, especially with American imperial hegemony. It used to be true that, and I think it continues to be true, at least for a while, that, what happens in America is, the main LARP, and then it trickles down to the sub LARPs wherever else you might find yourself.
Yeah, and it's highly probable that that will continue to be at least partly true. But I mean, then you look at you look at the European Union, which just recently concluded its investment treaty with China, in something of a rush ahead of the Biden administration coming in, and you can see fraying at the edges of that hegemonic power. Another thing which happened almost concurrently with that piece of news just a couple of days ago, which really struck me, was an op-ed in the New York Times saying, well, what about the Chinese interpretation of freedom? What about the freedom to go about your daily business in a state of physical health? They might not have freedom from political violence and they might not have freedom of speech, but at least they're not getting sick.
Oh,
and you're thinking, well, So, you know, isn't that a kind of freedom too? And I thought, my goodness, you know, what it made me think of was the character, you know, the character Captain Moreno in the film Casablanca, which I watched again over Christmas, where he says to Rick at one point, "I blow with the wind. I have no principles. I blow with the wind, and right now the prevailing wind blows from Vichy." And I was thinking, well, you know, there's a substantial proportion of the elite, which is now more transnational than it is affiliated to a political community as such, you know, that takes very much that view. And I think it's extremely significant that somebody at the New York Times should have sensed a shift in the prevailing winds to such an extent as to have published an op-ed like that, and particularly for it to have received no blowback, like, for example, Senator Tom Cotton's op-ed did last summer, when he suggested bringing in the army to quell the Black Lives Matter riots.
Yes, exactly, and it's interesting to see it from the other perspective as well, because you know, the Chinese state propaganda machine is churning out some quite spicy takes recently.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes.
One of their most recent tweets was a reframing of the Uyghur sterilization campaign they've been engaging with, you know, fervently in the last year, as female empowerment, liberation, as providing women trapped in a totalitarian, you know, mindset, the tools to free themselves and maybe just stop having children. It was quite an interesting way to frame it, and I think it tapped into liberal sensibilities. Yeah,
it's a spicy reinterpretation of something which is generally left unstated in at least one strand of liberal feminism, which is to say a belief that female reproductive biology is oppressive, you know, and that in as much as women can be liberated at all, that means being liberated from our biology. I mean, it's not the only strand of feminism. You know, feminism is an enormously diverse and very internally contentious movement. Yeah. But baked into feminism pretty much from the word go has been this question of controlling women's fertility and the interaction between women's fertility, our fertility, and the question of individual freedom. Because it's true. You know, there's an anecdote that I come back to a lot is the fact that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the founders of modern liberalism, forced his mistress to send all 6 of the children he fathered on her to an orphanage because he didn't want to be a father. And you know, and this against the backdrop of 18th century orphanages where the survival rate was less than 50%. He just felt like that was the right thing to do, and he never really gave it much thought. But you know, in a sense, he was. And Rousseau also excluded women from his ideal picture of the liberal subject. We were supposed to be charming, compliant support humans, while the liberal subject was male. And one of the things I've said recently is that actually, you know, you can from a slightly provocative perspective, you could argue that Rousseau's actually right, and that, you know, it is much more. It is difficult to be a female subject and also to be the ideal liberal subject. But my take on that is that this isn't a problem with women, as Rousseau might have suggested. It's a problem with liberalism. Mm-hmm. And that actually, if our concept of what it means to be a full human being is so constrained that we have to see ourselves as separated, atomized, and, you know, stripped away from any kind of relational context, then that is a woefully inadequate, and to such an extreme degree that it effectively excludes that half of the human population that exists, or at least some of our lives, in symbiosis with another human. Because that's what gestation is. Gestation and early motherhood is an experience of symbiosis, which is radically at odds with the sort of basic core tenets of liberalism. You know, it's an experience of merger, which is extraordinary, and for which we pretty much have no language within the sort of liberal mainstream. Exactly. And so if the liberal anthropology is so bad at accounting for the experiences of half of the population, then the answer isn't to try and fix the biology of that half of the population, such as to make it possible to fit us into the liberal paradigm. It's to change the liberal paradigm.
Exactly.
And I think to me, that's probably the nuclear core of reactionary feminism for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is essentially what we're experiencing at the moment. This is why, the main brand of feminism, the mainstream woke neoliberal feminism, is essentially trying to shoehorn women into the role of the liberal individual, which is essentially a man, or closer to a man than a woman. It's not even a man; it's someone completely stripped of any ties to their biology. And because women are closer to nature, just because of our inherent, the complexity of living a female life, the timelines, the pressures, the essentially the burden of gestation, like you said. It's almost impossible to do. And I feel like it's a bit of a trap to try to retcon liberalism onto us rather than the other way around.
I completely agree. I completely agree. And it does. Although I should say at this point that I'm immensely grateful to all of the efforts that all my feminist foremothers made to, have me not exist as chattel, to be handed from patriarch to patriarch. I kind of appreciate that, and the degree of autonomy I have in my life. I quite enjoy pursuing the life of the mind. I like working. I also like being a mother. These are not conflicts which it's ever easy to resolve, and these are live questions that I wrestle with all of the time. But one of the things that's very clear to me is that these are not questions which can be resolved by abolishing female biology, or even pretending that it's possible to abolish female biology, because that's at that point you end up in a position, within Western liberalism, which is separable from the Chinese Communist Party one by barely a fag paper, which is to say, an understanding of feminism which is fundamentally antinatalist. Now, I think it's probably no coincidence that women's liberation has coincided with a radical tanking of the birth rate.
Exactly.
Because the autonomous liberal subject that we're all celebrating as the ideal default human is not one which has the kind of symbiotic relational ties which are a core part of being a mother.
Exactly. I mean, the ever perfect individual is also kind of tied to the market, in the sense that
yes,
you have to be a perfect producer, to be someone who's worthy of the employment at Facebook or another pantheon of our age. You need to make that your priority, and to also be the perfect consumer, you need to be the perfect individual, because the market doesn't relate to you on any other level. They're not talking to families. They're talking to you, the person with needs and desires that are being created every day by this great propaganda machine that we're all hooked into.
Yes, absolutely. I think the aspect of the human condition which is concretized by motherhood, which is to say the fact that we belong to each other and not just to ourselves, is fundamentally at odds with everything that you just described. But it's also, it's not just present for mothers. It's literally true that I belong to my child, especially when she's in utero, and especially when I'm breastfeeding. It's literally true that I don't just belong to myself. I mean, it's a very physical experience as well. I would routinely wake up in the night a few seconds before my daughter woke up wanting milk. That's widely documented. I have one friend who's still breastfeeding her toddler, and her daughter would go a couple of days a week to a childminder, and my friend, even though she was a couple of miles away physically at the time, would always know when her daughter was hungry, because she would experience a milk letdown. And this is a phenomenon which has been well documented. It happens. The symbiotic connection between a mother and a small child is not something which we have language for, but it's real. That said, these are not the only kinds of interdependencies which exist. It's also true that men experience those sorts of relational interdependencies. They're just perhaps less animal. They're less physical. But it's absurd to suggest that men have no need for love, or find no meaning in family life and belonging. That's obviously not the case. It's obviously not the case that humans of both sexes prefer to live in an atomized state. That condition of alienation is one of the things which is driving our uniquely crazy brand of 2020s politics. So this, you know, this sort of dramatic fiction that we've all embraced, that relationality is kind of an optional extra, or is something which can be monetized and marketized as, you know, a consumer good, you know, it's fueling our crazy politics, but it's also just a lie. So, you know, if there's a wider political argument to be made from my reactionary feminism, yeah, and wanting to recenter women's biology and, you know, the politics of motherhood, you know, at the heart of human social life, it's about saying, well, it's not just mothers and babies, it's all of us, you know, we all belong to each other, and we have to make a positive statement to that effect, because otherwise that's going to be taken off us and sold back to us, and things are just going to carry on getting madder.
Yes, and it's going to be sold back to us in kind of this, yeah, in this hyper real form, like OnlyFans, or which is successful because it adds one more ingredient from the relational stack, and it also
Yes.
mixes it in with essentially slot machine logic with kind of intermittent rewards. So it's this chimera of you know impulses that people have, but it's essentially, it's not even masturbatory, it's sub-masturbatory, because you're just kind of tickling a few of your needs, but you're not really getting these things because they're hard to get. You have to be a certain type of person to kind of refine yourself socially, to go out there to go interact with a female of the species, to to become the kind of person who can have a good relationship. And I feel like people who are dependent on OnlyFans for their interactions with women, they're starved of this. They never really get to grow this type of this type of talent, because it is a talent. You need to face rejection. You need to better yourself, and it's really tough, because the real satisfaction and the real challenge is in actually having these the relationships that lead to fruition, that maybe lead to children, maybe bring us back from the cliff edge.
Yeah, and that sort of relationality also comes with costs. You can't belong to other people and have other people belong to you without a degree of commitment, which is radically at odds with the OnlyFans, what you call the slot machine model. You don't get to pay to play. The idea that I could Airbnb my role as a wife is self-evidently ridiculous.
Exactly.
Not because it wouldn't in principle be possible, but because my husband and my daughter would get pretty pissed off pretty quickly, and understandably so.
Yeah, and this is essentially what a lot of mainstream feminism tries to sell as motherhood empowerment. The fact that, if we just get state-sponsored childcare, that kind of solves a problem. Whereas if we can just sort it out, we can store the children with these women from Guatemala, and then you can go off and be the individual that you always wanted to be. But then this also ignores the whole relational component, that it's not interchangeable who takes care of your children and for what amount of time.
And there are acutely difficult trade-offs to be made there. I've tried to sustain for the last 4 years, to the best of my ability, that sense of slight symbiosis with my daughter. And there have been times more recently, especially under lockdown, because I've had to work, in order not to end up having to sell the house. There have been times when that's been really in tension with my need to be doing things other than looking after my daughter. That's a moving target. That's something which millions, countless women wrestle with every single day. And there are no one size fits all answers. All you can really do, I think, is to try and maximize your ability to work flexibly, such that if your children really need you, then you're able to make the decision to prioritize them. And that's the best sort of general answer I'm able to give, which leads me to conclude that actually, the answer isn't to try and fix childhood such that you can outsource it to women from Guatemala. The best solution, the best feminist solution, which doesn't involve just trying to go back to this sort of radical separation of working roles between the domestic and the employment sphere, which is just that's not a genie that's going back in the bottle, even if we wanted it to. So we just need to can that idea, unless except for the very wealthy who are able to make it work. The answer isn't to try and fix childhood or to fix women, it's to fix work.
Exactly.
In as much as we can, just to radically rethink work in the context of what it means to be a relational human. And particularly in terms of the obligations that implies when your children are young. And that will probably be more true for women than it is for men, just because that sense of relationality and that bond is more intense. I don't at me on that. It just is in almost all cases.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, this is a whole nother, Pandora's box about our insistence that women and men can be treated on equal footing in every sphere of life, from egalitarian sex norms, which are another disaster, to everything. But I think we can park this, and I will definitely take it up on the next time. But before I let you go, there is one question that I want to ask everyone on this podcast, and I know you haven't been warned, so this is not a scary question. No worries. Is there any thinker or writer that you are especially fond of, but you feel that they're not really getting their time in the sun? People don't really know of their thoughts, of their writing, and that might deserve, a little shout out, living or dead, doesn't matter, but someone that's influential, and you think should be more influential.
Can I have two?
Of course, have as many as you want.
The first I want to propose is William Ofels, who is not well known but should be. He's, I think, one of the most interesting writers on post-liberal ecology and politics. He's written a trilogy of books on politics in the age of scarcity, in which he argues that the technological age of abundant resources must inescapably come to an end because we're going to run out of resources. And when we do, most of what we think of as progressive politics will unavoidably come to an end with it. Because liberal politics, as we know it today, is premised on the idea of unlimited growth and boundless resources. His most recent book is called Plato's Revenge, and it sets out, not without some, I don't agree with everything in it, but some phenomenally interesting ideas on where politics and polity might go next, with hefty reference to the ancient world. It's very worth a read, and I think he's not widely known, and he should be. And the second is an Indian writer who I'm just reading at the moment, Nirad Chaudhry, who writes he writes about from the perspective of an Indian given a classical education within the British Empire, and who then lived through the collapse of the British Empire, visited Britain. And he writes like an absolute angel, and he brings a perspective to the disintegration of a culture and an empire, which I think is perhaps more relevant than ever to the world that we're living in today. So I would recommend that anybody who wants to go slightly off the beaten track, and explore some underrated perspectives on the world as it is now, should have a look at William Ofels and Nirad Chaudhry.
Okay, perfect. This is new to me, so this is exciting. I will have a look. Thank you so much, Mary. This was a lot of fun, and yeah, I can't wait.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
Perfect. Can't wait for the next one.
Thank you.